Welcome to the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life and our event today, Engaging the Social Dilemma, Social Media and the Polarization of Politics and Pews. We are very grateful for you to be joining us today for this hour-long event. It will be a discussion of the recent Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. We will be just give you a kind of rundown of sort of how we kind of anticipate the next hour or so going. I'll begin by just sort of laying out some overview here, do some introduction of our participants, and then the three of us will start off with 5 or 10 minutes of sort of opening prepared remarks about our reactions to this film and our thoughts on it and some of our insights into it. We will then proceed to have a bit of back and forth based upon Zach and Chrissy's reactions to it, and we would absolutely invite folks to also submit Q&A via the Q&A feature through the Zoom interface, and we'll take those toward the end, last 15, 20, 25 minutes of the talk today. Before I begin, let me offer some introductions here. And before I begin even further, let me first offer my thanks to both Susan Richard and Mark Massa for inviting us and organizing this event. We're very grateful to be able to talk through this documentary and some of the important topics contained within it. Let me begin by just offering a few words of introduction for our three panelists today. My name is Mike Serazio, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication here at Boston College. Most of my research focuses on media production, advertising, popular culture, political communication, and new media. My last book was The Power of Sports, Media and Spectacle in American Culture, and that looked at how sports culture explains and reflects contemporary American life. My previous book before that was Your Ad Here, The Cool Sell of Guerrilla Marketing, which is all about how brands are increasingly infiltrating social patterns, digital platforms, and entertainment content. I am joined today by my colleague in the communication department here, Assistant Professor Kristin Peterson, who teaches courses related to the intersections of media and religion. She earned her PhD in media studies from the University of Colorado at Boulder, where she was also a research fellow for the Center for Media, Religion, and Culture. Her research focuses on religious expression in digital media, specifically examining how young people engage with online media sites, images, videos, and creative projects as spaces to develop religious meaning. She is currently working on a book project on how digital media spaces facilitate intersectional feminist activism within evangelical Christian and Muslim American communities. She has published articles and book chapters on Muslim Instagram influencers, the digital mourning after the murder of 3 Muslim college students in Chapel Hill, hijab tutorial videos on YouTube, the Miss Marvel comic series, and the Mipsters fashion video. Third on our panel today is Zach Karanovich, a doctoral student in systematic theology, a proud Hoosier who hails from rural West Central Indiana. He has studied and worked in Indianapolis for 13 years. In 2007, Zach received his BA in theology and philosophy from Marian College, now university, and worked in parish ministry and religious education. After receiving his law degree from the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law in 2014, he practiced in public and nonprofit finance before moving to Boston to continue theological studies at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, where he received his MTS in 2018. His research interests are in political and liberation theologies, race and bias, grace and conversion, spirituality and ecclesiology, and how all of these might aid in the understanding and transformation of his own context, rural, working class, white America. So with those introductions out of the way, I'll begin by opening up with about 5 to 10 minutes of remarks, and then I'll pass it to Chrissy and then on to Zach. And then we'll open it up for some more fluid conversation between us. And again, we would very much invite you to submit any questions that you might have along the way via the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. And unless I missed a reference, I don't think Marshall McLuhan was name checked here, but he is undoubtedly the patron saint of this film. And that's his second canonization, by the way, after his first as the patron saint of Wired magazine when it was founded in the 1990s. McLuhan, as some of you may know, was an influential media theorist in the mid-20th century and arguably the defining voice of technological determinism. The medium is the message, is his famous aphorism, and the message of the social dilemma is that big tech has shaped our tools, and those tools have in turn grossly disfigured us, emotionally, socially, and psychologically, at the individual, political, and societal level. Social media, the documentary argues, has reoriented our perceptual scale, and it's conditioned the bandwidth of our thinking and values. Now, technological determinism as a school of thought has much to recommend, and it has certainly influenced my work over the years by emphasizing how certain media forms emphasize certain senses and ideals over others, and thus format industries of culture to produce certain work rather than others. But the eternal flaw with technological determinism, and perhaps the social dilemma's greatest liability, is that in its crudest reductive form, human agency vanishes altogether, and we become mere automatons for that which Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey have pre-programmed. This film sees us much as the tech companies seem to, as that floating hologram of a teen being tweaked by algorithms pushing our buttons. Now, let me offer a few words of praise before returning to that critique, because this is a terrific documentary on many fronts. First, it has a comprehensiveness in mapping an interconnected set of problems in American digital life: mental health and obsessive compulsive behaviors, disinformation and polarization, and unchecked corporate power via intrusions into our personal privacy. With a witty casting choice of Pete Campbell from the show Mad Men, the film anthropomorphizes algorithms in a clear, effective way, which is no small accomplishment, given that algorithms are programmed toward a proprietary opacity. That is, as users, we're meant not to see them, much less understand how they work on us. The film also prosecutes the addiction-inducing design logic underpinning an array of slot machine-like platforms that prey upon our psychological vulnerability. And it further illustrates how emotion, not rationality, as Jürgen Habermas would have preferred for our public sphere, governs the flow of information coursing through this digital architecture and the high speeds at which the system prefers to set its pace. We also see in this film generational patterns of screen dependency and social experience that foreshadowed fragility among millennials and seems to have exponentially increased among our cohort of Generation Z on college campuses today. And even in its technologically deterministic excesses, the film appropriately accounts for the almighty dollar here as well, and the way that the tragedies of today's social anomie are nonetheless also a triumph of business model intent. Advertising in particular wants something different of us, something more of us, when it demands our engagement, rather than the mere impressions sought in the mass media world of yesteryear. And perhaps what impressed me the most in this film is that it actually cracked the Silicon Valley omerta bubble of silence and got whistleblower apostates to talk on the record. That is no small accomplishment, really, and I would bet that many lawyer hours were spent parsing the non-disclosure agreements of these interviewees before they agreed to participate. These executives, they generally don't snitch, and the PR forces within this industry tend to operate with Stalinist transparency. And I say that as someone who spent a career trying to talk to elites in media, pop culture, advertising, and politics, and I've never had more solicitations go unreturned than when I've tried to get access to tech companies. My guess is that there's just too much money to be lost. and the folks in this film probably already made theirs before having a crisis of conscience about how it got made. Indeed, as I've been working on a book about authenticity in media, I actually chased down and interviewed 3 of the sources in this film from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram because they had already snitched. So in a very practical way, my gratitude goes out to the filmmakers for making that introduction. But much as there was to appreciate in this film, I found myself oddly inclined, as it wore on, to hedge some optimistic contrarianism, or at least deflate the dystopian momentum just a bit. Technological determinism often implicitly frames a Garden of Eden contrast from which we have fallen. Yes, disinformation has been a problem on these platforms, but fake news about weapons of mass destruction got us into the Iraq War a whole year before Facebook was even founded. So let's be cautious about romanticizing the veracity of journalism in a pre-fragmented media landscape. Yes, QAnon flourishes because of the dynamics of digital rabbit holes, but we've fretted about the paranoid style of American conspiracy culture for several decades before some loon shot up a pizza parlor in DC to free what he thought were enslaved children. And yes, social media is incentivized institutionally and algorithmically for our panic, but so too is cable news. And things went viral before COVID-19, depending on their capacity to infect our emotions. I propose this concluding question without at all wanting to take big tech's nefarious power off the hook because, well, to heck with those guys. And the question goes like this. What does putting all our problems onto an external media force absolve us of as users and individuals? Where, again, is the human agency to be found in the social dilemma? At one point late in the film, someone describes the architecture of these platforms as like tilting the floor in a room. You can still walk up it, but most people won't. The gravity works against you. Now, I salute the film's commitment to critiquing that gravitational tinkering, but I also want people to realize that we still have to find our legs in this space, especially when the state seems to do little to check that power. Now, I'm probably biased in this regard because I teach a 1-credit class called Antisocial Media that's partly about getting students to reflect and resist their technological dependencies and to rediscover their willpower in relationship to them. But I also can't help but wonder if this pandemic might cure us of our screens just a bit. After all, we've been unknowingly and mindlessly drifting into social distancing dystopia for the better part of 2 decades. It's a now ubiquitous feature of the public and private landscape. We take it for granted. Students in classrooms scattering their attention across browser windows, colleagues at meetings, furtively checking email under boardroom tables, and families at meals with faces illuminated by the flicker of individual screen lights. In short, we've been trying to live alone together well before Dr. Fauci told us we had to do so. The pandemic, I hope, might force us to reckon with an important question. Was that what we really wanted? I hope and pray that when things get more back to IRL, as the tech slang goes, our devices and screens might be tainted with the memory of being so long confined to them, and they won't tantalize with the promise of something somewhere else that's more interesting than the human beings surrounding us, in the flesh. I hope and pray that having forced to be really alone, maybe we won't want to be alone together so much anymore. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague in the comm department, Chrissy Peterson, to take the floor.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. I'm going to share my screen. I have just a few slides to show. I like to have some visuals as I'm talking. But again, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to the Boise Center for hosting this important discussion. I just want to kind of preface my thoughts with this, which I think relates a bit to what Mike was talking about, which is that social media are not the first new technology that have caused these kind of moral anxieties or social panics over these things. And they're also not the first technology to shape the way we understand ourselves, to understand how we understand society. We can look back to the invention of the telegraph, and the kind of the famous first telegraph message was, "What hath God wrought?" Right? So this idea of these existential concerns related to the power of media and how we communicate, these are not new. We could also look at photography and how the creation of photography shifts our sense of self. Now that you have an image of yourself that will live on after you die. You can also look at social and moral anxieties around young people and media, and looking at things like ham radio and teenage boys and concerns about what they're doing, who they're communicating with. So all this to say is that we've had these similar kind of anxieties and concerns about the inability to kind of control media, to control where the message is going. And also media studies scholars have long looked at the effects of media on our lives and the ways that those in power, companies, governments, have used media to manipulate us, have benefited from our labor. So all this is to say that, yes, I definitely agree with the critiques in the film. I find them very valid, but I also think we've faced these existential threats before, and we have models of ways to move forward and regain agency, as Mike was talking about, and also regain the humanity behind social media. I'm going to not really go through a lot of these issues because it's talked about in the film and talked about in the previous presentation. But I think the general overview I take from the film is that the critique of social media is the way that these platforms have been designed to capture and monetize our attention. And so you have the acceleration of these spaces, the spread of fake news, false information, highly emotional information. You have the anonymity of certain spaces, the lack of kind of accountability for things that people are posting. You have how information becomes more sensationalized, more polarized, more emotional in order to elicit that kind of gut level emotional reaction. And we all kind of exist in this TLDR life where we are always, it's too long, we didn't read it, we don't have time, we're just consuming and we are sharing and we're not and just reacting, right? And we're not actually sitting with things and deeply reading and responding to what we're processing and consuming. And so more clicks, shares, views, comments translate into more money for companies and corporations. And so this is kind of the overview of what the documentary, I think, really hits on a lot of the key points. And as was just previously discussed, it really takes this kind of technological determinist approach. And I think Tristan Harris, who's kind of the key figure in the documentary, a lot of the things he says about this tools-based technology shifting to more of an addiction and manipulation-based environment really illustrates this idea that we no longer control the technology like a bike. The technology controls us. And also this concept of arguing that we're in this moment where we're kind of facing this checkmate on humanity because the technology is really playing on our weaknesses and bringing out the worst in society. And so I think we could certainly see the ways that technology companies have ingrained their products in our daily lives and our social lives, our psychology, and it seems pretty impossible to kind of regain full control. One example I think that really illustrates this is if you think about harassment or the spread of fake information or doxing, and you can see how in a lot of these cases, there's very little legal avenues or ways to stop this from happening. And so we could say, well, there isn't a lot of control in some of these situations. And so I certainly agree with a lot of these significant critiques, but I kind of want to focus around my discussion around how we can move forward, how we can regain human agency and potentially design social media platforms that will encourage more ethical and empathetic behavior. So the documentary doesn't present a ton of solutions of sort of where we go, how we move forward. Obviously, it falls on the side of government regulation as being a really important step. And Harris pushes for this idea of ethical design and humane technology, but it's not really clear exactly what that is and how that would occur. And one of my main critiques I have with the film, or maybe one of my parts of it that I feel is left out, is this idea that social media, there's sort of a presumption that social media in this way is the only sort of natural universal model, that this is the way we should be, that we should communicate in this way. And this is the only way that is normal and natural and inevitable. And what I want to sort of think about is how we could potentially build on non-Western, anti-capitalist, communitarian models of social organizing and activism, and how that could potentially offer different avenues of thinking about social media and would lead to more collaborative, ethical behavior. So thinking about if we were to imagine social media built more on collaboration, an ethics of care approach, thinking about shared commons or empathy, and sort of thinking about how we could build something distinct and different. A few points that would be things to do, but also then I want to look at a few examples. So obviously I think like government regulation is key. Like you can't, this won't work if the companies are not held responsible. But I also think that there needs to be more of a move away from the advertising model. Like I said, that's not the natural, inevitable model for designing social media. And a space to kind of slow down, disincentivize spread, disincentivize these gut reactions. And so a lot of response would be, well, that would make social media boring and it wouldn't be very entertaining. But I suppose the response would be, is that what social media is supposed to do, right? Is it supposed to be this highly emotional, polarizing, kind of guilty pleasure space, or is it meant to be a space of dialogue and discussion and collaboration? And another thing to say is like, people talk about how we need these algorithms to make the user experience better, but we could look at algorithms like YouTube algorithms and how those led to more extreme content. And then I think having ways to promote more ethical behavior, more compassionate behavior that would benefit the larger community. And I think one way to do this would be to hold people more accountable for what they post. And potentially a way forward would be to think about social media as more of a shared space, like a common space, a park or a library, where everyone has something that they have to contribute and everyone has a stake in it. And so I think holding people more accountable, requiring more engagement, like real true engagement, could potentially lead to like kind of people kind of holding each other accountable for what they do and say in these spaces, and taking more agency and ownership over these spaces. So the last thing I want to do is just look at a few examples of some things related to my research, but some examples of how more marginalized communities have used social media platforms in ethical, productive, and compassionate ways, while still remaining kind of cognizant of these limitations. So one example that I think is mentioned in the documentary, I mean, Wikipedia is kind of the classic example of an online platform that is not monetized, that is cooperatively created and provides the same information for everyone. Another example that I was thinking of is the mutual aid networks and how these predated digital media, obviously, but these are networks of ways to sort of come together and support the community and solve problems within the community. And in more recent years, mutual aid networks have been using social media fairly effectively. And a lot of what happens on here is not only about kind of collaborating and coming up with these solutions and organizing, but it's also about dialoguing and discussing, what are the concerns that people have? What's the best solution to address things like food insecurity in our community? So this is a good example of how a social media platform can lead to better outcomes for the community. And then a lot of my other work, as was mentioned, I'm working on a project that's looking at how those who've kind of been ostracized, marginalized from religious institutions find spaces of connection and support online. And so we can look at some of the work happening around former evangelical Christians related to purity culture, and so in spaces like Twitter hashtags or online forums, podcasts, there's a lot of really productive, healing, supportive work that's happening. An example of a podcast community is the liturgist community. And they have, in pre-pandemic days, would meet up and have, offline meetups, but now they have a pretty active online community. And as you see here in their statement of their community, they're very cognizant and aware of the downfall and the limitations of social networks like Facebook. And they talk about how their space is not about data mining or advertising. It's about protecting your privacy, and it's meant to be a supportive communal space. And then another space that I've looked a lot at is Instagram and looking at Muslim women, and how in more recent years, there's been a shift away from just posting about fashion and consumption and kind of the influencer economy. And there's some young Muslims who are doing a lot more work related to political activism, also related to creating these kind of healing spaces, as you can see here. And another person to focus on, talk about it, is the Village Auntie, and she does some really fascinating work related to teaching Muslim women about sexuality, and she bases it on a tradition of kind of within African villages of having like an elder figure who teaches the other women and young girls about their sexuality. So using this space of Instagram in a way that's not about commodification, but is meant to sort of recreate the community spaces that existed offline as well. So all these cases, I think it's about building community together on a deeper level, counter to this kind of capitalistic push to monetize everything and to push everything to these extremes. And so I feel like these examples show the way that those who've been marginalized have always kind of playfully molded these social networks in ways that they find productive and meaningful, while they're still very cognizant and aware of the limitations of these spaces. And these are just a few examples of the ways that they can be, social media could be used in a more mutual, collaborative, and empathetic way. So obviously I don't see this as like an easy solution, but I think it's more relevant to sort of look at possible ideas and models to move forward. And as I said before, I think one of the biggest issues I have with the documentary, and more with like Silicon Valley in general, is that these platforms are developed from this very individualistic, capitalistic, First Amendment, free speech, absolutist, patriarchal perspective. They really fail to acknowledge that that's not the inevitable or natural way that these platforms can be structured. And so I think it's interesting and relevant to sort of think about alternative ways to structure them to support cooperative action, virtuous behavior, and responsibility to the larger society. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Chrissy. Appreciate those comments. And I see we've got already a couple questions coming in. We'll certainly attend to those after Zach offers up some of his thoughts. So please take the floor, Zach.
Sure. Thanks to both Mike and Kristin. I appreciate your great insights. And as a result of your comments, I'm going to make a little bit of an adjustment on the fly of some of my remarks. So I'm grateful for that input. My comments today seek to push the conversation a bit beyond the social dilemmas evaluation with regard to our political life and into the sphere of religion, which sort of follows what Kristin has been talking about. And while my perspective certainly applies to many faith traditions, I think it will become obvious that I'm working exclusively from a Catholic sphere as a social media user myself within that, unfortunately not an influencer. To be clear, the church is not immune to polarization. Reading stories about Vatican II and how those documents came to be, there's a lot of polarization in the church. There's a lot of disagreement. And in reality, the conversation that happens at those theological levels is not of interest to the average Catholic on the street. But there's something that social media is doing that seems to be changing that dynamic, especially within the religious sphere. Turning a bit more autobiographically, referring to my childhood and upbringing in Clinton, where, if you could believe it, Karanovich is not an unusual sounding name. When I was growing up, social media didn't really exist. As a result, my Catholic world was small. The most educated theologian that I knew was my parish priest. And whatever he said went. His interpretation was my interpretation of the faith. Of course, I knew other things were going on. I knew who the Archbishop was. I knew who the Pope was because of a diocesan newspaper and maybe some news. But generally speaking, theology was local. As I went through high school, AOL emerged, social networking began in places like MySpace and chat rooms and things like that. And by the time I arrived at college, generally speaking, most of the ways that we interacted on the internet were on sort of website-like blog posts, some creation of a page that you visit and read, not a whole lot of interaction itself. It wasn't until my junior or senior year of college that Facebook was really an option. At that time, your college, I think, had to have some agreement with Facebook for you to even be on the platform. You had to have a college email address to be on it. And I resisted that urge. I was kind of a Luddite through college. And it wasn't until after I left that I joined. And what became quickly apparent for me was that the tone of the online discussion was very different. Even theological posts attracted sort of less than charitable comments, and they pit Catholics against Catholics. And posts were a way of declaring your allegiance to either the traditionalist model, the progressivist model, or something in between. But more importantly, the theological conversation no longer was local, but the boundaries had expanded. Now, as the boundaries expanded, this enlarged environment allowed for more platforms to multiply, and a multitude of voices began to and continue to enter the scene. Now, a lot of those are mainstream. We think of the Vatican News Service, or Busted Halo, or America Magazine, or the National Catholic Reporter, or the Register, depending on your tastes. Or we can even think of that 2012 tweet, the first from the Pope, Benedict XVI, which I think was a video of a cat on a Roomba. But then along came people like Michael Voris, the founder of Church Militant and St. Michael's Media, who at least now seems to be solely interested in spewing hate, homophobia, and racism at members of the church. They call to question the faith of many Catholics, Catholic persons, Catholic individuals, Catholic institutions, Catholic organizations. Even my own undergraduate institution was written up on this platform. And interestingly, however, Voris and St. Michael's Media, they're not permitted to use the word Catholic in their advertising. They've been prohibited from such by their local bishop. Now think too of Frank Pavone, the founder of Priests for Life, this very vocal advocate for Donald Trump, serving on Trump's Catholic Advisory Council. And while I certainly don't question a priest's right to talk about right to life issues, he's probably best remembered for having what he claimed was an aborted fetus on an altar on a video that went viral, advocating for his position prior to the 2016 election. It's a pretty outrageous incident. Pavone, too, much like St. Michael's Media, seems to be on the outs with the church. No one can quite figure out who his bishop is anymore. So every dog needs a leash. More recently, we think about Bishop Tobin from Providence or Bishop Strickland from Tyler in Texas, who question Biden's faith, or who promote the now infamous video from Father Altman entitled "You Cannot Be a Catholic and a Democrat," which ultimately landed Father Altman as a slap on the wrist from his bishop. But were it not for YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, the Catholic on the street would likely have no idea that Pavone or Voris or Altman even existed, let alone the narratives that they're peddling. But the following that these folks have gained, Voris, for example, 24,000 followers on Twitter, Church Militant, 40,000, Pavone, 150,000. And those are just followers, not people who encounter the message, who either don't follow or hear from it secondhand. They make these guys not insignificant influences on the church. And thinking about it in light of these three factors, I think is really important. First, if you click on any Catholic affinity group on one of these platforms, it's very, very likely that one of these guys is going to enter your path. You're going to stumble across their material at some point because of the way that the algorithms push you. Secondly, these are not poorly funded outfits. These are places with great graphics, and ultimately they have clerical garb involved in some way frequently. Pavone is a cleric. He wears a priest's collar, those sorts of things. And finally, what they're saying oftentimes resonates with people who find them, or can resonate with people who find them. So they hear a message they like. They also hear an additional narrative about people that they don't like, and they continue to build the biases that they've already brought to the table with them. So now, in light of those three factors, that we have clerics involved, that we're going to run into these people, and they're saying things that they like, that readers or viewers like, the most educated theologian I know now might not be my parish priest at all. From my perspective, he might be a liberal hack that the bishop has sort of punished us with. Instead, these guys are the authority for me. They seem to know what they're talking about, and some of them are even priests. The collar really does mean something. So think about this in the context of the Pan-Amazonian Synod a couple of years ago. The Vatican and interested parties gathered to talk about the challenges facing the Amazon region. And with any event like that, there's a lot of culture on display. And one of those elements of the culture was Our Lady of the Amazon, or some rendition of the Mother of the Amazon, which had a parallel in the Blessed Mother Mary. more commonly known as Pachamama. I think most people would know that name. And a lot of folks on fringe Catholicism were looking in saying, we cannot accept a non-European looking statue, one especially that was unclothed, that could reflect Mary in that way. Instead, it's an idol. And pretty vocal advocates for removing these idols surface. So for example, Taylor Marshall, who's a philosopher turned Catholic YouTube commentator with some 72,000 followers on Twitter, emerges and heavily criticizes the synod and considers Pachamama the idol that needs to be removed, which inspires an Austrian who I think Marshall might have paid to steal the statues and to throw them in the Tiber, which is certainly a criminal act. And the Vatican even spoke out saying, look, this is the ultra-conservative social media platforms that are fomenting hatred that ultimately lead to acts like this. So my point being, however, is not, I'm not, this is not a diatribe against French Catholics, but I want to point to the fact that prior to social media, this didn't get the time of day. Now, however, these fringe conversations are becoming more mainstream. And the positionality of these people offers a new form of authority to the point that for some of the faithful, they are more authoritative than the Pope himself. So again, disagreements are one thing, but denying the authority of the one who holds the chair of Peter is quite a new level, at least with this scale, with this breadth. That's the work of social media, I believe. It's problematic figures with a patina of authority who offer ideas that confirm biases and sow seeds of doubt. The algorithms take us there. The church is not in a position of critical distance, but rather the political tail is wagging the religious dog. The social media is not a tool like a bicycle. It is not neutral. Instead, it's pushing us to our corners. And so the question then, what do we do about that? So Kristin gave some reflections on what might happen on the industry side of things, and I'm gonna go kind of on an ethical side of things. One of the things that we can do, particularly within church spheres, is to begin to cultivate a virtue of humility, to recognize that on a both top-down and bottom-up level, in a process that moves both directions, we have to acknowledge that we don't have all of the truth. This resonates with Martin Luther King's sermon, Love Your Enemies, where he says that of the many reasons to love your enemies, one of them is that the particular bad thing in your enemy is not the sum total of the enemy, that we're all some sort of combination of good and bad. And as a result, we have to recognize that we too carry those things, the sort of bad things in us as well. So instead of thinking of seeking truth over and against someone, instead we seek truth together, which begins by some acknowledgement that those with whom we disagree have some good in them and some truth that they're making a claim about. We need to be honest with the real. We have to maintain our responsibility to the truth. However, that doesn't mean that we can spend all of our days correcting the falsities that we read on Facebook or Twitter. That would be a full-time job. I don't think we'd have the emotional bandwidth to do that. But it is important to speak to those maybe within our closest spheres, so our family, our closer friends, those over whom we have some power of transformation or influence, and also open to being influenced by those same people. The problem is, I think, and what social media really magnifies, is that real life is nuanced. And while social media trains us to think of things simply in black and white and in the context of a meme, it's a lot more gray. And if we're ever going to grapple with the real and grapple with the true in a way that can overcome the polarization that is growing both in our politics and in our religion, we're going to have to slow down and take the time to talk with one another. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate those thoughtful remarks. Appreciate the thoughtful remarks from Chrissy as well. And I appreciate some of the questions that are coming in. That's much appreciated. We'll dive right in to be able to try to address as many of the questions that we've got in the order that they've come in here. So first question we have is, if you were the communications advisor to the president of Boston College, what 3 things would you advise him to do to improve the technology mental health of our students? I'll jump in first on that one with both a generalized response and then a very concrete one. In some ways, it seems to me that the problems identified in the social dilemma that I think Chrissy did an especially good job highlighting are precisely the things that a college is equipped to address. A liberal arts college is even more equipped to address, and a Jesuit liberal arts college is especially equipped to address, right? So the problems of the social dilemma are speed, the inability to sort of slow down, and deep attention. I mean, all of those things are the virtues and the hallmarks of I think, what we hope to do here. And so I don't know if I can come up with 3 things on the spot, but one thing would be to institute perhaps a campus-wide, 1 day a semester tech Sabbath, right? Of course, it's voluntary. Of course, it takes buy-in, and of course, it also probably wouldn't work. But I say this simply by virtue of having the experience over the years of talking to colleagues in media studies who will often have an assignment where you ask students to do like a 1 day, stay off your media and just sort of like journal about that. And generally speaking, anecdotally speaking, there's always, I think, a real positive vibe that we tend to get from students coming out of those experiences. And so I think to perhaps institutionalize that in some way across campus, to make it a kind of, like a holiday, a ritual, a quasi-cultural aspect of the institution, would be really cool to try. So that would be one thing off the top of my head. Chrissy, Zach, do you have any thoughts on this advice question?
I was going to say the same thing, do some sort of Sabbath. I did that in my class this semester and it worked really well. I was also thinking more of an advice is just that maybe use social media as a means to connect with people, but not as the means of deeper connection. So to have it be a way to kind of coordinate and but to have spaces where you're with people that's not through the social media platforms. I think that helps to develop better relationships, but that's more of like a personal advice I would give to young people.
Nothing much to add on my part, but I would say it seems to me that that even in experiences in which we are called to go deeper into those conversations, we still find students, who sort of sneak out their phones to check or to tweet or to whatever they're doing, check their Snapchat and stuff. So
yeah, I mean that's the addictive quality of it, right? And I will say one other thing before I turn to the next question on this point. And I say this a lot to people, but I say that, if the pandemic doesn't change you, you're doing it wrong. And I will say that one way in which the pandemic has changed me has been to reorient what I think about the classroom space. And, going forward, and certainly this year that we've had in the midst of the pandemic, I've been inclined toward trying to reduce and encourage / require students' technology uses to not happen within the classroom, because I think what I've realized is part of what we as faculty can do, part of the thing that we're giving is not just knowledge, but it's license to be off your phone for an hour. Yeah. And that's actually, I think increasingly that's maybe being understood as an enticing thing rather than a punitive thing. And so I think that's one way that I've come to grapple with a technology mental health solution. Second question here that we have from Evan Nair. I apologize for the pronunciation there. How do you move away from the advertising model? How does that work? Chrissy, I'll throw that to you in a second. Let me just chime in real quick because I saw that question come up and I was mulling on it. To me, in some ways, the question could be answered like this. If the BBC or PBS were designing a social media platform, how different might that look than what we've got from Facebook, Twitter, and so on, right? I mean, if you think about the contrast of how news is created and disseminated and how those news organizations talk to you, right? How the BBC regards you, how PBS regards you as a public service institution of media, as opposed to how CNN or Fox regards you, I think you could probably see a similar analogy play out with regard to a social media platform that might be designed with more of a public service ethos. And let me also say this, there's nothing permanent about these platforms that say that they will be, in power forever. Rupert Murdoch blew a fortune in the mid-aughts buying MySpace at its peak, and that turned out to be a tremendously wasteful investment. Facebook, as best as I can tell, is entirely irrelevant to Generation Z. It's like the phone book. And so, the platform du jour, TikTok, is hot right now. I have no confidence whatsoever that in 3 to 4 years' time, that will be the platform du jour. So these platforms come and go. They have largely been based upon an advertising model, but I do wonder if there was more of a ethos of, say, the BBC, how that might look. Concretely, I don't know how you map that out, but that would be the kind of imagination that I would think in response to that. Chrissy, feel free to take that.
The other thing I was going to say definitely relates to what you're talking about the BBC is if you look at what's happening with journalism right now, there's a huge emergence of nonprofit journalism. And it's a similar idea of like, how do we, because journalism, you know, the advertising model imploded on journalism. So it was like, how do we survive? And it was a real intentional refocusing in a lot of these nonprofit journalism around, you know, what is the point of journalism? Is it just to make money? No, it's to inform the citizenry and to be a resource for the community. So if you think about social media in that way, and you could create something that's based in that model of nonprofit support or community support, I think that would be another way to look at it. Let's see.
Zach, do you want to weigh in on that, or we'll go to the next question?
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Great, fantastic. So it looks like here from Mike Durkin, Kristin, your examples of how things might work better going forward gave me a hope for the future. At the same time, as you said, it's a big job to get there. Is there / are there ways to accomplish this at scale without significant government intervention, since that intervention brings with it some drawbacks? Government controlled information, obviously, you know, there's a tradition of sort of First Amendment ideals within the United States. You know, Chrissy, feel free. I think that might be most directly relevant to you. Feel free to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a need for government regulation because there's a lot of things going on these sites that is, you know, that is illegal, or that, I mean, like I was talking about the harassment, like there has to be a way that you can prosecute people for, you know, doxing people online or revenge porn. So there's definite space that needs to be regulated. But maybe the solution is not that we need to do it at scale. Maybe the solution is smaller, you know, smaller gestures or creation of smaller spaces. Maybe we don't necessarily need one large social network. Maybe that's part of the problem. And so maybe like Facebook may eventually become less of a popular space, and other spaces may come up, and you might have a mix of sort of nonprofit models versus, you know, collaborative common space models. But I think that the government regulation is sort of like necessary, but I don't necessarily think that it has to be this like overall at scale approach. I'm not sure if you have other responses, Mike.
No, I mean, this is one that, yeah, I mean, I don't have any special, or I have no special takes on this question. It's one that I puzzle over. And I think there are folks who are much more versed in the sort of like internet policy world that could speak to that than I can. Mm-hmm. So a question from an anonymous attendee, and we got about 10 minutes to go here, and I'll try to keep to time. We'll try to get as many questions as possible. In the early 2000s, I studied with Robert Putnam of Social Capital fame. Terrific. Bowling Alone is a book that I still use to assign students, and it still resonates. I tried to argue the positives that Kristin has. From my personal perspective, the internet can disseminate important information, in my case, medical information about the developments in a Parkinson's treatment. Putnam, at least at that time, saw it as highly disruptive to important constructive connections. 20 years later, I would say it has done both. What are the actual steps that can emphasize one over the other?
Meaning the positives over the negatives, is that?
I think that's maybe the reading of that question. Yeah.
I guess you just say that. I mean, I think the thing is, it's like, as we were saying, it's not the social media that causes a lot of these issues. It's just the way people organize. So, I mean, the other point I was going to make about the, you know, nonprofit models is like, there's one good example of a non-advertising based model of social media, which is like 4chan and 8kun and these spaces. Like they don't have advertising, and they're spaces where a lot of terrible things happen. So, I guess it's just, there isn't like an easy solution to say this is going to lead to positive versus negative, but it's more that people use these spaces in a variety of ways. Yeah, not sure.
I think that's apt. Zach, I want to throw this next question to you, if you don't mind. It feels like it speaks very much to, I think, the insights and that you had in your remarks. How can you cultivate humility among the very perpetrators of the ideas that are antithetical to what we believe? And if you could answer that question in 30 seconds or less.
Sure. Here's the key to the universe. Well, I think there are two things that come to mind initially. I mean, the first of those is be mindful that you're working within spheres of persuasion, I guess. That, you know, with your family or your friends, you have a certain amount of authority on a certain topic, or maybe this is your discipline of specialty, whatever that might be. I mean, obviously, it doesn't work in Anthony Fauci's case all the time, but you have spheres of authority or persuasion, and those gradually ripple out. That's one way of thinking about this. You kind of have to work where it will work best. The second thing that comes to mind, however, is that even for those who disagree with you vehemently, if you were to start to dig deeper in those disagreements, I think you begin to find value systems that you can begin to resonate with. So sometimes, for example, some of the values, if you read books by Nancy Eisenberg or Hochschild, Strangers in Their Own Land, and others, they articulate value systems that underneath what appears to be some pretty explicitly racist outcomes, underneath all of those things are systems of loyalty and betrayal and class consciousness and all these sorts of things in a way that makes the effect seem, okay, well, maybe that wasn't the first intention, for example. I'm not speaking that universally and explicit racism is a real problem, but there's something to be said about digging deeper into those value systems to finding what it is that you can agree on in something that on its face looks as though it's something that you cannot buy into.
Excellent.
Or unwilling to cede ground on, I should say.
Absolutely. Chrissy, I want to throw that question to you, just because I know that you study so deeply the dynamics of personal experience and digital experience in spaces that are often within religious traditions that often perhaps tend toward extremism or the doctrinaire. And so I wonder what your answer to that question might be in particular.
The question about humility?
Yeah.
Let's see. I mean, I think there's a issue with like thinking about the way that you have this sort of cancel culture. I think there's a bit of that, right? Of like not wanting to even engage sometimes from the left, that people are sort of hesitant to really engage with some of these concepts. So I guess that would maybe one way, but I haven't really come across a lot of this specifically in a lot of the work I'm doing, because a lot of the people I'm looking at are people who've been sort of harmed and marginalized by very, homophobic or misogynist language within religious spaces. And so there isn't a ton of like wanting to engage with those ideas because it's been so harmful and hurtful. So it's more of a work of sort of rebuilding a new understanding of, a theology that values those who've been marginalized. So I don't really come across a lot of this in terms of this question, but yeah.
Next question from Frank Garcia. Tristan Harris's website highlights a number of immediate practical steps users can take to dilute the effects of social media. How can VC amplify those options for students right now? It's a terrific question. Also on that point, Frank, it was one other critique of the film that I had, which was that they managed to bury, like in the credits, here's some concrete things that people can do to not allow this dystopia to envelop us any further. And I thought, I don't know, it just felt like a very kind of afterthought outtakes place to put that part of it, which is, I think, to some degree, what you identify here. I think how can, as an institution, how can BC amplify those options? I mean, I think on one hand, certainly offering, classes. I know Chrissy teaches a class that's certainly one credit class as well that sort of orients toward this question. I think that, so I'll riff for a second here. Within this class that I teach, anti-social media, part of the course is dedicated towards students over the course of the semester trying out 2 or 3 different habits that relate to their technology usage, and to sort of like reflect and sort of monitor how those impact their thinking and emotions and sort of social experience. And, those come organically from the students, right? It's everything from voluntarily deleting a social media account, installing demetrification software, which is basically where you can sort of engage with these platforms without necessarily knowing how many people exactly are liking your stuff. Even at the very basic level, I've read some stuff on if you set your phone screen from color to black and white, it has the effect of being less enticing to you. So there's all these little hacks and tricks And there's a book that I have students read called How to Break Up with Your Cell Phone that actually has a number of these suggestions along these lines. So, I mean, from the level of what BC can do on this front, nothing immediately springs to mind, but there are, I think, ways in which to address this. Anyone want to jump in on that question as well?
I would only say, I think it relates to the next question too from Megan, that about like discerning how you use social media and how to make undergraduates more aware. I mean, I guess I would say from my experience, it seems like the students are already kind of thinking and processing and doing these activities. So I don't necessarily think they're, just living in this bubble where they're unaware. Like they're very aware of a lot of these things. They've seen this documentary, they're talking about these issues. So I guess it's more, I mean, I think they're already primed for that. So it's more just like kind of creating these spaces and opportunities for people to talk about these things. And so I think that would be my answer.
Great. Just going down here. So to Marcus's question here, and I see we've got just a couple minutes left. Zach, you suggest that social media has given opponents of established church doctrine a space to gain followers and challenge the church. Why can't this be considered a strength, in the sense that the contest for ideas debate produces contradictions, ideation, and superior outcomes? Or to put it another way, generating knowledge through debate and the pursuit of enlightenment is an objective of Jesuit belief. What say you, sir?
Totally agree. I think there's a certain amount of polarization that is absolutely beneficial to the development of our society, our cultural knowledge base. Jonathan Rauch wrote an article, the Constitution of Knowledge, in which he advocates for the sort of looking kindly on polarization, not extreme polarization, but the polarization that allows for us to work toward greater truth. The problem is that now what social media does, it does not provide the opportunity for those poles to converse and work their way back to a higher truth. There's no emergence into some new level of truth or knowledge or reality. So while I think that there are certainly opportunities where expressing a contrary opinion to church doctrine is not a problem. I mean, I think we see that happening all the time. I mean, I think even what Kristin is saying, that there are moments that for the benefit of the faithful, that they need to be able to have spaces where that can happen. But we also need to find ways in which we can reach a new level of truth or depth of our faith, or commitments to doctrine that move beyond the poles and back into a singular community. So I guess the difference is dialogue versus schism. And I think what we're seeing now are a lot of schismatic types of movements, particularly on the right, in the conversations that are happening on social media, in religion.
Fantastic. So I see that we're up against the time here. I want to first apologize that there was some other terrific questions here in the Q&A that I think, just for the sake of time and folks needing to get to their next digital space here today, I will apologize that we won't be able to attend to. I do see one at the bottom there about providing the titles of resources we have cited. So if you go to the Boise Center's event page for this, there is a tab where you can look through. And there are a number of suggested resources, books, some screenings that are certainly relevant to this topic. I think that the fertility of the Q&A period here, it bespeaks what is a film that I think very much touches the nerve in terms of where we're at in this moment and the degree to which it's influencing our politics, our mental health, and our kind of individual orientation to the world. I want to just wrap up by thanking both Zach, Chrissy, and Mark and Susan for putting this opportunity together to speak on this subject. I think certainly all of us would be certainly happy to field any further questions via email if there's any follow-ups folks wanted to converse on. And just as I see the time hitting 1 o'clock, I want to thank you again. I wish you all the best as you proceed forward in this semester and in this difficult year. Thank you, and have yourself a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.